Imagine for a moment waking up in a small wooden cabin in the Middle Ages and realizing you've reached 50 years old. Today that seems ordinary, but back then, it was almost a miracle. Your body no longer responds the way it used to. The hands that worked the fields your entire life now tremble. Your back hurts when you try to stand up. The few teeth you have left can barely chew yesterday's hard bread. Your vision has weakened. The cold seems to pierce straight through your bones. And in the fields, where every strong arm meant food on the table, you begin to realize something terrible. You can no longer work the way you once did. For decades, your value in that society was simple: strength to produce, plowing the land, chopping wood, carrying heavy sacks, surviving the winter. But now, every movement requires effort. Every day feels harder than the one before. And in the Middle Ages, this change was not met with compassion. Because in that brutal society, where survival depended on constant physical labor, aging quickly stopped being an achievement. It became a problem, a burden, a risk. The houses were small, food was scarce, and every extra mouth meant less food for everyone. So a silent question began to emerge within the family itself. A harsh, cruel, almost unthinkable question. If you can no longer work, who will feed you? And the answer to that question in many cases was far more brutal than we imagine today. But before I reveal just how far this reality could go ahead and leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Because in the next few minutes, you're going to discover something almost no one talks about regarding old age in the Middle Ages. And what some families did when the food started running out is one of the darkest chapters in human history. To understand why growing old could become a cruel fate in the Middle Ages, you need to grasp one simple and brutal truth. There was no retirement. There was no pension. There was no social safety net. And certainly no guarantee that anyone would take care of you once your body stopped functioning. Survival depended on one single thing: daily, physical labor. Peasants plowed the land with rudimentary tools. They chopped wood to survive the winter. They walked miles carrying heavy loads, and almost all of it had to be done every single day. If you didn't work, you didn't produce. And if you didn't produce, the food simply didn't appear. Families lived constantly on the edge. Small wooden or mud cabins housed parents, children, and sometimes even animals in the same space. Food stocks were minimal. A longer winter, a bad harvest, an unexpected illness, and the entire family could plunge into hunger. In this scenario, the elderly depended completely on their children or younger relatives. But even the children often struggled just to keep their own children alive. Every piece of bread had to be divided with extreme care. And when food began to run short, the conversations inside those houses could become painfully practical. Whoever worked the most ate first. Whoever produced the most had priority. Because deep down, everyone knew something no one wanted to say out loud. In times of scarcity, surviving could mean making impossible choices. And for an elderly person who no longer had the strength, those choices could quickly place them in the most vulnerable position of all. But food scarcity wasn't the only thing that made old age difficult. As the years passed, many elderly people faced something equally devastating: the complete loss of respect and value within their own community. In their youth, a man or woman in the Middle Ages had a clear role: work, produce, support the family. That effort brought something essential in that society: respect. But when the body began to fail, that respect could disappear in a silent and cruel way. The elderly person who once led the family began to lose space in decisions. Their opinions no longer carried the same weight. Now it was the younger children who decided what would be planted, who would work, how the food would be distributed. Authority changed hands. Many elderly ended up relegated to minor tasks: tending a small garden, mending worn clothes, or simply staying inside the house while others worked. But even those tasks were not always enough to justify their presence in a society where every resource was scarce. Some ended up living on the margins of their own community. Old people sitting at the doors of houses, watching the days go by. Others walking slowly along the roads, begging for a piece of bread. Begging among the elderly was not uncommon. Without strength to work, without their own resources, many depended entirely on the charity of strangers, and loneliness began to grow. Because old age, in that harsh world, was not just about the body weakening, it was also about becoming invisible. But when truly difficult times arrived, when famine spread through the villages and stocks disappeared, the situation of the elderly could become even more desperate. Because in those moments, the family's survival came before anything else. If old age was already difficult in normal times, during periods of famine it could become a true sentence. The Middle Ages were marked by constant food crises, crops destroyed by heavy rains, summers too short to ripen the wheat, plagues that devastated entire fields. And when that happened, entire villages plunged into despair. Grain stocks ran out quickly, the bread became smaller and smaller, and families began dividing portions that were barely enough to keep someone on their feet. Winter made everything even worse. No harvests, not enough hunting, and the cold draining the last energies from the body. Inside the dark, freezing cabins, impossible decisions began to emerge. Who would receive the largest share of food? Who needed to stay strong to keep working? Because if the younger arms weakened, the entire family could die. In many cases, the logic of survival was brutal. First came those who could work. Then, if anything was left, the others. Historical records show that in extreme periods, the elderly were often the first to suffer the consequences of scarcity. Some were encouraged to leave home to seek food on their own. Others simply left the village, walking slowly along the roads, and many ended up living on alms, trying to survive from door to door. It was a cruel reality, but for desperate families the priority was clear. Keep alive those who could still guarantee the future. Because in a world where every winter could mean death, living longer sometimes meant becoming the first to be sacrificed for the family's survival. For those who managed to survive these hardships, old age often ended in loneliness. Without strength to work and without family able to support them, many elderly ended up depending on the only institution that still offered any kind of help: the church. Monasteries and religious institutions sometimes distributed bread, soup, or temporary shelter to the poorest. Some medieval hospitals, which were very different from modern hospitals, served more as shelters for the abandoned, where the elderly, the sick, and the poor could spend their final days. But those places were few, and they were often overcrowded. That's why, in medieval towns and villages, one scene was common: old people walking slowly along the stone streets, hands outstretched, asking only for a piece of hard bread and or a few coins. The cold punished their fragile bodies. Hunger was a constant companion. And the deepest fear was not just poverty, it was something even more silent. Dying completely alone, without family nearby, without anyone to hold their hand, without even someone to remember their name. Old age, in that world, could mean slowly disappearing on the margins of society. But the most frightening thing is that this brutal reality was not just an individual tragedy. It deeply shaped the way the entire medieval society viewed aging. And understanding this reveals a surprising truth about the past, a truth that almost never appears in history books. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of this whole story is this: very few people actually reached old age in the Middle Ages. Today, living past 60 or 70 is common. But in that harsh and unpredictable world, life was much shorter and much more fragile. Average life expectancy was extremely low, but not just because of old age itself. The real reason was at the beginning of life. Infant mortality was enormous. Many children simply didn't survive the first few years. Diseases we treat easily today were devastating. Simple infections could kill in a few days. Small wounds could turn into death sentences. Without antibiotics, without modern medicine, without any real protection against epidemics, plagues, famine, and wars swept through entire generations. That's why when someone actually reached 50 or even 60 years old, that person was already seen almost as an exception, someone who had survived everything the medieval world had that was cruelest. But as we've seen throughout this video, surviving that long didn't necessarily mean comfort. It often meant facing the hardest part of life: a weak body, total dependence on others, and a society that rarely had space for those who could no longer produce. Today, many people fear aging. They fear gray hair, wrinkles, the passage of time. But for much of human history, growing old was not a fear. It was a rare privilege, and at the same time, for many, a long and silent sentence of suffering.